If you have a Bible and you find it helpful, please turn it to Romans chapter 2. This is where we will spend our time today. Paul is going to refine this ideation of judgment by God, and he's going to demonstrate to us what cosmic fairness actually is. Let me read the text if I could. I'll begin reading in verse 12 of chapter 2. For as many as have sinned without the law will also perish without it, and as many as have sinned in the law will be judged by the law. For not the hearers of the law are just in the sight of God, but the doers of the law will be justified. For when the Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do the things in the law, these, although not having the law, are a law to themselves, who show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and between themselves and their thoughts, accusing or excusing them. In the day when God will judge the secrets of everyone by Jesus Christ, according to my gospel. Paul is refining this idea of what judgment really means, and he's demonstrating within God's judgment there is no partiality, there is no distinction. It doesn't matter whether a person has the law, doesn't have the law, whether a written code of law from God is available or unavailable. No human conscience is going to be not judged by actually the law, which is written on the human conscience. Our human conscience is imprinted intrinsically. This is an important biblical doctrine. Everyone has a conscience. And it's one of the great levelers for all of humanity when one thinks about it in this way. We are, all of us, at one point or another in our lives, we're going to defy our consciences, and we know it. We know it when it happens. As Jerry Clower used to say, we know when we're messing up. Well, he's correct. We defy our consciences, and we know when we do so. In the smallest of arenas, it makes no difference how big the defiance of our conscience or small it is. In any case, when we defy our conscience, we are in effect sinning against the law that is written intrinsically on our hearts as we who are made in the image of God. A little quip I read said this. It said, envy went to church this morning, and being legion, envy sat in every pew. Envy fingered wool and silk fabrics and hung price tags on other people's tags, price tags on their suits and neckties. Envy paced through the parking lot, scrutinizing all of the vehicles, the chrome and the paint. It marched to the chancel with the choir during the processional. Envy prodded the plain Jane wives and the bright wives and the kind men. Envy stared at everyone. This small little quip unpacks us, it uncovers us in some respects, in that we are all prone to defying our own consciences. Paul's text here uncovers us all to God's scrutiny. How odd that we don't take this scrutiny seriously. And we don't. I can speak for myself. I don't take it seriously enough. There are times when I do things, say things, think things, allow my mind to drift to places I know it shouldn't go. And I do it knowing all the while that God knows what I'm doing. It really boils down to an honesty with God. That a will, our own wills, if our wills are open to Him in a voluntary way. In the letter to the Hebrews, the writer says in verse 13, chapter 4, no creature is hidden from God's sight. All things are naked and open to the eyes of Him with whom we must give an account. Where does this leave us? It's a stark fearsomeness, really, when one thinks about it. Are we happy? Here's a question I think that uncovers us inside even as we sit here today. As we think about that passage from the letter to the Hebrews, does it make us happy or does it make us sober? Ask yourself that question as I ask myself that question. We are all judged by one criteria. One. Every person on the planet, whether they have heard the gospel or not, whether they live out in the bush, they've never heard the name Jesus, it makes no difference. Every person on this planet is judged by one criteria, and that is, have we obeyed the moral law? Whether we have it codified or not. How do I know that? Because in every culture and every place on the earth, every human being has a conscience. Now, our consciences are an indicator, but one of the problems with our consciences is they are fallen too. So they're not always an accurate and utterly reliable indicator as to where we fall in that capacity. Where are we in our standing before God? Are we happy about His scrutiny, or are we not happy about it? Paul says to Titus that our conscience can be corrupted. Paul says to Timothy that our conscience can be seared as with a branding iron. Well, where would these conditions leave us? If that's the case for any of us, and I would say it's the case for all of us in various areas, to one degree or another. As J. Budziski says, we are so fallen, we do not know how fallen we are. One could follow one's conscience and still be deeply in sin. And God's judgment would be the same. Say, for instance, this. A Jew goes into the synagogue or the temple on the Sabbath and hears the Torah read. The ability to excuse one's self in the face of the Torah did not exist for the Orthodox Jew. But the Gentiles have no Torah. Their criteria is different. And I would say this, in some ways, the Gentile has a stricter standard because they don't have a list. They don't have a list. Their conscience, the common knowledge of their conscience in the Gentiles' case, where no written law is, that's a harder standard to meet. But even within that, within a corrupted conscience, we're unable to really know our failures many times. There are things that I've done, thought, said, participated in, you name it, and the same goes for all of you, wherein we have done these things with a conscience that is not sensitive to where those things lie within the moral standards. That's why we need mercy. That's why we need mercy. The true test, of course, will be the standard of the gospel. Acts chapter 4, verse 12. No other name given under heaven and earth by which we must be saved. God is going to hold us responsible for the light we have. And the gospel through Jesus as judge will be applied to our lives. Now, this is where it gets tricky, because for some, they see this standard and they say this is unfair for the person who doesn't know. As we looked at in times past, we've looked at this whole ideation of I didn't know. And we've examined that very carefully. The problem is we really do know. That's the problem. Everybody knows when they defy their own conscience. Everybody knows when they lie. Everybody knows when they obfuscate. Everybody knows when they do something that they know they would not appreciate having done to them. Everybody. Every human being, every culture, it bypasses all of the cultural categories completely, and it becomes a very human thing. God's judgment is completely fair, therefore, in every respect, because He is looking at the heart. He is looking inside. So when a person does something as an outward activity that they do not know, they really do not know, either their consciences are corrupted or they're just innocent in it insofar as their own conscience is concerned, but it is something that defies the moral law, God is looking at their heart. And that's why Paul says their hearts either excuse them or accuse them, dependent upon where their heart is in terms of the ability of the person's conscience to accurately know what the moral law is. There's a terror in this affair, but there's also a freedom within the terror. As in the song Amazing Grace, we were taught to fear by grace. God's mercy taught us to fear. And there's a freedom in that it places us into the location of a total inability by any behavior to truly get ourselves somewhere with God. I'm not saying that there aren't behaviors and activities and thoughts and ways of thinking and doing that God's not pleased with. Don't mishear me. I know He's pleased with good. When the good is done, when the good is thought, when the good is spoken, when the good is acted upon, God is pleased by that, but that is not going to save us. The person who never hears about the gospel, the law, they don't hear anything about God, is judged by their conscience of morality. They all have a consciousness of morality, the conscience. And if you look across human culture through the centuries, yes, there are discrepancies. Yes, there seems to be some moral progress in some general ways. We don't keep slaves in this country anymore. Although at a time in history in which we didn't keep slaves, Hitler and Mao and Pol Pot did their evil. So maybe the progress is not so much progress. I don't know. Only God can sort that out. But it is significant that throughout all cultures and all time, there is a basic common moral, a basic common human set of morals, a moral intuition that we all share. Somebody comes up to a small child, the child A is holding a toy, child B, small child B, comes up to small child A, snatches the toy from child A's hands. Child A is offended by the action. Child B knows they've done something that wasn't quite right. Where did they get that? Not all of it is inculcated. Some of it is intrinsic to our conscience. Paul says in verse 13 that all who do the law will be declared righteous. Now, what does that mean? It can't mean that people can actually behave perfectly. That it cannot mean. I mean, if we could do it all perfectly, a person could come up, be born into this world. From the moment they are born, they live a righteous life right up to the time they die. They don't have any infractions of the law whatsoever in the entirety of their life. They walk up to the gates of heaven. The gates swing open. They march down the road till they come to the throne room and they say, "Move over, now there are two of us." It's not going to happen. That is just utterly impossible. So it must mean something else. It means that the secrets of our heart are going to be judged, and no human being will escape that gaze. No human being. All who do the law will be declared righteous. That's right. But none do the law. That's the problem. The guarantee is there. The problem is nobody meets the criteria for the guarantee to be paid out. There's your problem. So none of us can escape, as none of us can do the law. Whether it's written or internal or the combination of the two makes no difference. None of us can obey it. Not perfectly enough before God. So what about you and me? As we are here today, are we afraid of God's gaze, or are we not? Is there some trepidation in our hearts toward that gaze coming to us? I'm going to raise my hand and say, for rip snow, there is. I feel trepidation. I know my own life. I know my own conscience, and I know my own thoughts. And I know that there are things in me that I'm ashamed of. And so when God's gaze, which is always upon me, when I think of it, when I allow myself to go through the mental process of becoming conscious of that gaze, I find myself feeling trepidation. Absolutely. Who of us anywhere sitting here today would say they have never ever defied our conscience? I don't even think that's the real question. The real question is whether or not we'll admit it to ourselves. Will we admit it to ourselves that we have? 1 Timothy chapter 4 speaks of a seared conscience. Now, what is that about? Paul writing to Timothy in Ephesus is talking about what happens when a person defies their conscience on a regular basis. It's kind of like the person who's going to be a martial arts champion. One of the aspects of the martial arts is that your hands have to be very hard. And how do you do that? Well, one of the activities is you take a bucket of sand, I've seen this done, and you extend your fingers and you jab your fingers into that sand over and over and over for hours every day. And then you take your fist and you strike the sand. And after you've hardened yourself to the point that you never ever feel it, you do it until you feel irritation, and you do it a little longer, and you continue to do that, and pretty soon your hands begin to callous, your fingers begin to callous. It's kind of like learning to play guitar. You first start, it hurts really bad. After 5 minutes you're hurting. The next time maybe after 10, the next time maybe 25, the next time a half an hour, and then after a few years you can play as long as you want without any pain whatsoever. Those calluses build up. Well, what about a heart? The same thing happens according to Paul under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, that our hearts can become seared in the same way, and we can no longer feel that sense of wrong. When our consciences are defied, we are no longer sensitive to it. How do you fix that? Well, the first thing that has to happen is the condition has to be identified. Now, the cleansing, having our hearts sprinkled and washed, as the letter to the Hebrews says, in Jesus' blood, may not be an active experience for some of us. For some of us it will be very active. But if we truly come to Jesus for forgiveness, that cleansing is there, and it is very, very real. In Hebrews chapter 9, the writer speaks of the cleansed conscience. That our conscience is actually sprinkled with the blood, and that's being purified by it. Our assumption is that this is an experience for us, and then once we're cleansed, all is well. In the same letter, in chapter 10, the writer speaks of our consciences having been cleansed by the sprinkling of Jesus' blood. One might not be able to feel this. It might not be an experiential element of who we are as Christians. It may just be that we have to trust that from God's perspective it is so. It has happened. Are we ready to surrender ourselves to His scrutiny and allow that cleansed conscience can occur, to confidently approach Him, not on our own accounting, but by Jesus' accounting? Are we willing? I can speak for Rip Snow and tell you I want that. I want to come to God full and free, without any of the guilty conscience. I want my conscience sprinkled and cleansed continuously. And even if I can't feel it or experience it, I want to be able to trust that it's there. Do we want that? It is there for all of us. It's to be had, and it's already been paid for. The price that was paid was sufficient for us all. Our consciences can be cleansed and restored, even the one that has been seared. The mercy is there. It's available for us all, and it's the only way that we'll find our consciences healed, such that we do have the sensitivity then to be able to begin to trust them over time. I don't know where everybody is here today.